Hi, this is Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop, and today we're going to take a deep dive into multiband compression and dynamic EQ. We're going to answer a whole bunch of questions about them, including what is a multiband compressor and dynamic EQ, why use them, and why use one rather than the other? Are they really that different? And the short answer there is they're both pretty much the same kind of tool. Under the hood, multiband compressors and dynamic EQs do basically the same thing. They're frequency-specific compressors. But the ways in which we use them and interface with them really feel different enough that they totally deserve their own separate categories. A multiband compressor splits up the frequency band into two or more parts. It's very common to find 3-band and 4-band multiband compressors, for example. But a dynamic EQ is basically a multiband compressor with the interface of an EQ that lets us get even more surgical and even more precise. Today, I'm going to show you all of my favorite ways to use multiband compressors and dynamic EQs and a few other types of frequency-specific dynamic range control. But I'll show you not only my favorite ways of using these, but broad principles that you can apply so you can find your own favorite ways of using them. And we'll look at some of the classic uses of these on a variety of instruments. The most common way for me to use these tools in mastering is to take a dynamic EQ and subtly reshape low frequencies or to try to target specific spots or specific instruments in the frequency distribution that are standing out a little bit too much some of the time. But there are also some great ways to use these tools on individual instruments in the mixing stage. Notably, bass, drums, and vocals can be great places to use multiband compressors and dynamic EQs. And you don't have individual faders for every element inside of a stem or a sample. Multiband compressors, dynamic EQs can really be lifesavers. I'll play a whole bunch of great before and after audio examples for you, like these. The first track I have pulled up here is off of an album I've just been mastering for a band called Londinium. Really great production and mixing work here from one of the band members named Varun. And I wanted to show you a kind of exaggerated version of what I might do in mastering with a dynamic EQ. For this particular example, I'm not going to try to precisely recreate the master I did. I'm just going to pull up the Kirchoff-EQ and try to help illustrate some of the principles at play. When I'm using dynamic EQs in mastering, often the dB changes could be a half dB, a dB and a half, but here I'm going to be doing some pretty extreme stuff where we're going to hear changes of as much as 6 dB or even 12 dB. But they're not going to sound as big as they look because with a dynamic EQ, the EQ that's being applied is transitory. It's happening for only a couple hundred milliseconds at most, sometimes less. In this particular case, I'm trying to bring up the subs in the kick drum without bringing up the low end on everything else. And I'm trying to duck down some of the bass frequencies a little bit further up on both kick and bass. This big boost here, though, is happening just in the center. This is set up mid-side, so the EQ is not being applied to left and right and just to the center of the bottom end of that kick drum. I'm using this dynamic EQ almost like a de-esser up here, around 7 or 8K, where it's ducking down just in the center channel. And it's also going to take a little bit of that high brightness off of the snare drum, as well as a little bit of sibilance off of the vocal. But another cool thing that's going on here is there's a little bit of a dynamic EQ in the lower mid-range, right here around 200 hertz, and it's really sucking down mostly the fundamental of the snare drum when that hits, and has this cool effect of bringing the guitars forward slightly. I've done my best to level match the examples here, so they're not going to be more than a half a dB or a quarter dB apart in level, but I think you'll hear the after version sounds louder than the before version. Here's our before and then our after.
Felt this way before. It's a revelation. You reached inside and made me smile outside my expectation. It's all that matters now to me.
Cool. So that is the verse section of this song called Bond from Londinium. If you want to hear the whole thing, we'll link to it in the description down below in the video. There's a really fun chorus payoff there that you have to go check out their Spotify to hear. This is a much more exaggerated version of what I did with the Dynamic EQ in mastering this track, so the actual final master sounds different than this. But I think you get a sense for the concepts here. Instead of doing 9 and 12 and 6 dB changes with Dynamic EQ, in an actual master, I might do more like 1 to 3 dB changes. But you can actually get away with more Dynamic EQ than you can with a regular EQ, because you're targeting that EQ not just within the frequency spectrum, but also within time. It just happens for a very brief period, often to accentuate the transients slightly, like I'm doing here in the kick drum, or to curtail them a little bit, like I'm doing up here in the more sibilant ranges around 7 and 8K. Of course, a different track that you're working on might need the opposite EQ curve of this one, but the principles remain the same. Let's hear some more of our common examples: drums, bass, and vocals. Let's start off with a drum track here, once again from Dave Abruzzese. Dave is a killer drummer, probably best known for his work playing drums for Pearl Jam, but he also plays for a band that I've done some mastering for called Zootopia. We've used a track of theirs called Believe in the demo I did for the Lindell MBC. And here's some raw drum tracks that Dave sent me from another project, and we'll check out both the Lindell MBC on them and the Lindell 354E. Each of these multiband compressors has a different tone. And what I want to focus on here is the idea of compressing the mid-range in the drums without compressing the entire kit. In general, where you're going to hear the most artifacts from compression are going to be on things like cymbals. So sometimes compressing the high frequencies less than the mid and low frequencies can be a good idea if you don't want to hear too many of the artifacts from compression on drums. Another problem you can run into when you're compressing drums is sometimes the kick drum will be the most dominant, loud thing in the submix of the drums because it has the most low frequency energy. And if you use a regular broadband compressor, you can end up getting more compression on the kick drum than the rest of the kit. So having a separate band, once again, for the mid-range that isn't influenced by that overbearingly loud kick drum can be beneficial too, if you don't want every single kick hit to suck down the rest of the kit by triggering the compressor across the entire drum bus. Let's take a quick look at the settings on this MBC. You can see I have the most extreme threshold set on the mid-range, and I've backed way off on the low end, and there's only a tiny bit of compression happening in the high frequencies. I've also set the highest ratio and the fastest attack for the midband. And the midband setting has a pretty extreme release. But it's only compressing from about 200 Hz up to 750 Hz. So really just the low mids and some of the center mids are getting compressed. Not the lows and not the highs nearly as much. Let's hear before and after. And I think you can hear the drums start to really tighten up there by doing some significant compression on the mid-range, but we don't get all that artifacting from tons of compression on the high frequencies. Another nice little byproduct here is our multiband compressor is almost acting like a little bit of an EQ. Because it's compressing significantly from 200 Hz to 750 Hz, this has a similar effect to cutting out some 400 or 500 Hz on the overall drum bus, which is a really common thing to do on drum buses. So we're getting some of that tightness from scooping the mid-range, as well as some of that extra control and attitude from compressing the mid-range. But we don't necessarily have to get that scooping. If I boost up some of the makeup gain on this mid-channel, then we'll get a slightly different feel, where you're going to hear the compression a little bit more. Because we're no longer using the compressor to bring down this lower mid-range, I'm bringing it right back in. So now we'll have just as much low mid-range as before, but we're going to have really controlled mid-range. So you start to hear some of that attitude and color and aggression of a compressor, but again, without over-compressing our kick drum or our cymbals. Let's hear this version of the before and after. So that's a cool sound. Instead of getting more of a scooped and tight sound, we're getting a fatter and more colorful sound, but we're just getting that color in the mid-range, and we're not adding excessive color or excessive artifacts to the lows and highs. This is a great approach to compression on drum buses or drum stems, or if you're working from things like samples. Let's hear this same general vibe instead of with the tighter, more assertive sounding MBC, now with a fatter, smoother, creamier Lindell 354E. Here's our before. Pretty cool, right? Same idea. We're adding some additional control to the mid-range, not nearly as much control to the lows and highs. And we're getting a sound that is really smooth, really thick, really creamy, really satisfying. And you can see up here, I kind of just took their drum bus smooth preset and just tweaked it a little bit to taste. There's some really awesome presets in all these multiband compressors, and they are a great place to start. In almost all the examples I'm showing you today on multiband compression, I flipped through the presets, found one I liked, and tweaked from there, just to show you that you don't have to be a rocket scientist to use this stuff. Feel free to grab a preset. If it sounds great, use it. And if you want to tweak further from there, go for it, which is what I did. All right, another example I have for you here is another classic place to use multiband compression on bass. And the classic approach here is usually to compress the low frequencies more than the mids and the highs. The low frequencies are often the part of the bass sound that's going to be the most erratic, that's going to fluctuate the most in dynamics. Having too much low frequency on bass in general can detract from the power of things like kick drums. But even if you want a bass sound that's really fat and big on bottom, having erratic bottom end on the bass can make your whole mix sound really unstable. And this is where something like multiband compression comes in. Once again, we're going to be using this multiband compressor a little bit like a compressor and a little bit like an EQ. It's usually really important on bass to find an area in the mid-range that you want to really speak on the instrument. A really common beginner or kind of amateur mistake is to try to get more level and more audibility from the bass by bringing up tons of low end or just bringing up the bass fader overall. Often, the thing you want to do is find the right spot in the mid-range to accentuate. I find that on bass on rock records, often between 800 hertz and 1.5K can give you some extra detail and articulation without making the bass sound overly bright. That said, sometimes you want to push a little bit of upper mid-range on bass, and things like 2K, 3K, 4K, or even higher can add a little bit of sizzle, edge, or detail to the bass that might be necessary. Exactly what frequencies you pick depend a lot on genre and context, but that's the general vibe of what we're going for here. Significantly compressed lows, less compressed mid-range, and less compressed upper mids. Here we're going to go from a really tubby, old-school retro bass sound that came straight off the DI for this band, Cartoon Lizard. And with just the click of a button, we're going to turn it into a much more modern, tight, and controlled bass sound that's going to work a lot better in the context of a mix. Let's hear this before and after. That's a pretty big transformation for just using a compressor. I'm also doing another little fun thing in here. You'll notice that the attack times are different. On our low frequency band, we have an attack time of 10 milliseconds, where on our mid frequency band, we have an attack time of 0.03 milliseconds. This means that although we're compressing the low frequencies a lot on average, we're letting some of the initial punch of those lows through uncompressed. And then when it comes to our mid-frequency band, we're making it much more tightly dynamically controlled. I've also got an even higher ratio going here on the frequencies below 120 hertz. Once again, I just took the plain bass preset to start with and then tweaked from there. Another really important application for multiband compression is on vocals. And here, multiband compressors are often used to do significant amounts of compression to get much more modern, contemporary vocal sounds. The beauty of multiband compression on vocals is that when you're doing a lot of compression, you can actually hear the compressor a little bit less, and you can get a bit more of a consistent and polished vocal sound. If, for instance, you have a really chesty singer and around 200 or 300 hertz really overwhelms a traditional compressor and makes the compressor really suck down on the deeper bits of that singer's vocal chain, you might end up undercompressing the rest of the mid-range and the high frequencies. Or if you have a vocal sound that's particularly nasal or mid-forward, you can end up with heaps of compression on just that part of the vocal. Whenever you find yourself in a situation where you're trying to apply significant amounts of compression to a singer, but the vocal tone just seems a bit uneven, it just changes too much from one register to another, and it's having trouble sitting well in a modern, dense kind of mix, that's a great application for a multiband compressor. And right now I have this Lindell MBC pulled up. This is once again the tighter and more assertive sounding multiband compressor from Lindell and Plug-in Alliance. And when you want to add a little bit of shine and presence to a vocal, this can be a great one to go with. Let's hear the before and after, this time on a track called Jackson by Taylor Bloom. We've heard bits of this track before in some of our other videos in this series, notably on the Varimu compression one. And let's take a different verse of this song now. Here's our before, no compression.
I've looked around so many times and thought of all the other lives I've lived and lost in other planes of time. I poke around this empty space, put fresh cut flowers in the vase. I trace the wrinkles on my face, and soon I start to cry.
It's a cool sound. We're bringing up a little bit of the detail and some of that vocal fry kind of sound without adding too much sibilance. And although the before and after are pretty well level matched when it comes to average level, you'll notice that because we're applying more compression, the quieter bits of the vocal phrases come up. So in addition to the character benefits, of course, a compressor is like having a little bit of automatic volume automation on your track, and multiband compressors do it exceptionally well on vocals. You don't necessarily need a multiband compressor on every vocal track, but when you want more compression, but to hear that compression less, or if you want a vocal to really sit consistently in a dense mix, this kind of multiband compressor can be a great way to go. A multiband compressor doesn't have to sound this tight and assertive though. We can go for a brighter sound that is a bit smoother and a little bit silkier. I'll bring up the Lindell 354E. This is based on the classic diode bridge compressors that just have a really creamy, rich, fat sound. And when you go bright with them, there's still this silky smoothness about them that's really nice. Let's hear this before and after.
I've looked around so many times and thought of all the other lives I've lived and lost in other planes of time. I poke around this empty space, put fresh cut flowers in the vase. I trace the wrinkles on my face, and soon I start to cry.
All right, for one last example, I want to demonstrate a vocal stem that already has a ton of effects built into it, as well as significant amounts of compression. Sometimes when you're dealing with stems or samples, a multiband compressor can be one of your greatest tools to use. This is a female vocal from a track called Bother by an artist called Twin Lights. But here's the isolated vocal stem, and you can tell there's a whole bunch of effects baked right into it.
Running from something I don't have the answers to. My friends say it's nothing, I'm still getting over you.
So, cool vocal sound. There's a little bit of extra sibilance in here in the high frequencies, but there's already significant amounts of compression going on where the other transients are already well controlled. So what we could do to the sound, if we wanted to shape it a little bit more, is we can actually uncompress it a little bit with a multiband compressor. Now, I'm not talking about using a compressor in expander mode. What I have going on here is a compressor that has a really slow attack time for vocals set in the low bands and in the mid bands. This is allowing some of the initial transients to get through on the meat of the vocal and is going to bring some life back to the lower frequencies and mids in this vocal. But I've got a really fast attack time set on the high frequencies on this vocal, So everything above 4K is getting a bit more compression with a little bit of extra transient control. So we'll get a little less sibilance out of this vocal while also making it even a little bit brighter still. Let's hear this before and after.
Running from something I don't have the answers to. My friends say it's nothing, I'm still getting over you. The drinks keep on coming and I don't know what to do. I'm lost in the thought of a love that I ran from too.
So I think you can hear, although the vocal is staying nice and bright, we're adding some more dimension to it, and even though we're adding some more compression to it, it sounds a little bit more alive and a little bit more like it's leaping forward in the speakers. And we also have this nice effect in the high frequencies of smoothing out some of that sibilance a little bit, so those S's and T's aren't quite as pronounced, while keeping the vocal sounding nice and clear. Well, I hope you got a great sense in this video for the ways to use multiband compression and dynamic EQ on your tracks. Both of these types of tools are extremely valuable. I use dynamic EQ all the time in mastering, often for little subtle shifts, often to reshape high frequencies a little bit or reshape low frequencies just a little bit in a way that's really transparent. When it comes to the mixing stage, I'd encourage you to look closely at these tools for things like vocals, bass, and drums. Use them to add more control to lows, or more control to the high sibilant ranges, or more control to the mid-range without getting all sorts of artifacts on your highs and lows. When you want to do some broad overall reshaping on individual instruments, I really love the classic compressor style of multiband compressor like the Lindell MBC and the Lindell 354E. When you want to get really precise and surgical, especially in cases like mastering or spot treating individual instruments, then the dynamic EQ functions in the Kirchoff-EQ are absolutely wonderful. And when you want something in between with the interface and sound of an old school analog EQ, coupled with some really gorgeous, smooth sounding opto compression, the TOMO Audiolabs LISA dynamic EQ is absolutely wonderful. If you want to hear that one in action, check out the full-length video I did on the TOMO Audiolabs LISA, where we go into a whole bunch of audio examples using just that dynamic EQ. I hope you enjoyed checking out these plugins with me. I had a lot of fun going through them. Let me know, have you been using any of these multiband compressors or dynamic EQs in your own mixes or masters? Are there some other frequency-specific dynamic range control plugins from Plugin Alliance that you've really been loving? Let me know in the comments down below. I absolutely love to hear you guys, and I read all of the ones that come in. If you haven't used these plugins yet, you can just go over to plugin-alliance.com where you can try out any of these tools we looked at today for free for 2 weeks. And of course, if you have the mega subscription bundle, all of these are just plugins that are part of that subscription at no additional charge. Thanks again for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop, once again on the Plugin Alliance channel.